Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today, part of the Brown Bag series. I'm Cydia Reese from the Office of the Chief of Staff. I just want to do a very brief introduction of our special guest speaker, Marissa Aho, the Chief Resilience Officer from the Office of the Mayor. And I think she's sticking to her title. She has an ankle injury and she's resilient through it. So thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. Hi, everyone. I'm very, very, very excited to be out of the house on day 6, joining you all. I was hoping, I'm going to talk a lot for the next few minutes, but I was hoping that you all would introduce yourselves and what part of the department you're in, because maybe I can highlight some things specifically tailored to our fine audience today. So if that's okay, who wants to start?
Tom Ferranza with the Strategic Planning and Development Review.
Great.
Eddie Guerrero, I'm with the same office with Central City Planning and Development.
Gordon County with outside operations.
Richard Smith. All right, Chief of Staff.
James Carlin, I'm with LADOT Department and Parking Meters.
Nina Gazan, I'm with City Planning, sorry, I snuck in. I work on mobility.
Hi, Nora Frost, Communications.
Andrea Lipton, I'm with Hughes Fellow, and I'm working on Leadership Academy.
Oh, great.
Miles Mitchell, Government Affairs.
Okay. This side.
Thank you. Medgar Parish Communications.
Hi, I'm Brian Hill, Chief of Parking Enforcement and Traffic Control.
Paul Weinberg, Emergency Management, DOT.
Okay.
Hi, good afternoon, Mariana Valdivia with Transit.
Great.
Jacob Brothers with Transit.
Great.
John Bogies with Design.
Fantastic. So I'm very excited, one, to be with you today for a number of reasons, and two, to talk about the mayor's new Resilient Los Angeles strategy that was released. It'll be 6 weeks on Friday. And I've been in the mayor's office for nearly 3 years. And we've been working on a lot of different, thank you, on a lot of different aspects of resilience. And so I think the plan for today is just to give a little background on sort of the Office of Resilience in the Mayor's Office, the background of sort of how we've been building on existing efforts through the new strategy, and then highlight different aspects of the new strategy. This is it, right here. It's 180 pages, and there's no way I'm going to talk about all of it, but I'm hoping to highlight a few things and then save some time to have a discussion and to answer questions and to maybe talk about specific aspects that interest you that I cover in the overview. Sound good? Great. Okay, and I'm pretty good at this, but it's a new way of operating for me, so apologies. Mayor Garcetti talks about resilience in a number of ways. We talk about how Los Angeles is a resilient city. We've been through a lot, we've bounced back, but also in terms of how we practice resilience, and resilience being a value of the city and a value of the administration, and thinking about how the actions that we make today can affect our children and grandchildren. And the definition of resilience that we like to use is around the capacity to survive, adapt, and thrive in the face of chronic stresses and acute shocks, and even transform when conditions require it. And this year has been a okay year for resilience. There have been a lot of catastrophic events. There have been a lot of disruptions. We had our own 5.4 earthquake last week, as a reminder that we do live with seismic risk every single day. But the way that we've been looking at resilience hasn't just been about earthquakes, and it hasn't just been about hurricanes or flooding in other areas. It's really been about the intersection of those shocks, those crises, the disruption events, and the underlying stresses that we live with every day. And so how do we stitch together the community fabric on a day-to-day basis, on a blue sky day, so that we'll be able to better absorb and transform after a major incident. And we know that we'll have one. It's just a matter of when. So Los Angeles became one of the 100 resilient cities in 2013. We were part of the first 33 cities that were selected. Now there have been 100 cities selected out of more than 1,000 that have applied. 100 Resilient Cities was started by the Rockefeller Foundation in celebration of their 100th anniversary. They thought of a transformative project that they could work on and have contributed more than $150 million to stand up 100 Resilient Cities as a separate organization, and then to basically fund chief resilience officers, and in Los Angeles, our deputy, for 2 years. That time has passed. We're still here. Assist with the development of a comprehensive resilience strategy, which is what was released on March 2nd of this year. Give us access to global partners, thought partners, and other like pro bono services that help us innovate in the space of resilience and see what works and what doesn't. The idea here is that if we can incubate things here, those things that work can be shared with other municipalities, other jurisdictions, other locations. And then the fourth offering of our partnership with 100 Resilient Cities is to take advantage of the global network. So there are chief resilience officers and their teams in 91 cities around the world. And I work with a number of them on a regular basis to share best practices, tell the good stories about the work that we're doing here, and then also learn from them in you know a number of ways. For instance, 2 weeks ago I was in Mexico City signing an agreement between Mayor Mancera of Mexico City and our office in San Francisco on how we learn from the work that Mexico City is doing to build back and to be more resilient after their September 19th earthquake, as just an example. But resilience is not new. This document, while extensive, is really just highlighting a lot of what we're already doing. And so we started out about 2 years ago with this process, typical planning process of engaging a lot of external and internal partners and looking at what we were already doing to build resilience, and then looking at where there were gaps and where there were opportunities and how to fill them. For those not familiar, in 2014, Dr. Lucy Jones, who's a seismologist, I think the Beyonce of earthquakes is perhaps my favorite reference to Dr. Jones, and she has a new book coming out on Tuesday for anyone who's interested. So Lucy was in the office for a year working with the mayor's seismic safety task force, developing Resilience by Design. Resilience by Design was released at the end of 2014. I was hired a few months later to help implement the recommendations that are in this report. So this report is specifically around our most vulnerable buildings, water infrastructure, and telecom. And there are 17 or so recommendations that we're moving forward, including the seismic retrofits that are happening now. We're retrofitting 15,000 buildings in the city of Los Angeles in the next 7 to 25 years. The water infrastructure, we're creating a seismic resilient pipe network with LADWP so that when there's an earthquake and the water system doesn't work, we'll have reliable water locations for firefighting and for potable use. And what does that look like if we start investing in a system now? Where will we be in 50 to 100 years? And then telecom, in 2015, we started to require telecom facilities to be built at a public safety value, importance value standard rather than regular. And so all new cell towers that were built after 2015 need to be a little bit stronger to help us in times of emergencies. And then also, Mayor Garcetti has committed to getting earthquake early warning to Angelenos by the end of 2018. And that is something that my office is working on daily to make happen with USGS. And then also, I know many of you are familiar with the Sustainable City Plan. Resilience is a part of this plan, and that's really focused on a lot of what's in Resilience by Design and some disaster preparedness work, but specifically around urban heat and urban heat island and urban heat island reduction work. Quick highlight. So, this is Resilient Los Angeles. It was created through focus groups and working groups and workshops and a lot of internal and external input. And we really looked at a combination of what are we doing already that we can build on. That's probably about a third of the recommendations are what we're already doing. A third of the recommendations are what we're doing but elevating it or looking at it in a different way with a different lens, whether that be multi-hazard or whether that be looking at things that we do on those blue sky days and how they would respond to a disruption. And then about a third of them are just new things, either things that fill gaps, best practices that we should be implementing here, innovations, and so on. And from the beginning, these 5 areas were the areas identified as what we really needed to focus on. And how we talk about resilience as more than just earthquakes or more than just disaster preparedness, but really making sure that we look at equity, economic security, we look at climate adaptation, we look at infrastructure modernization, and we really look at leadership and engagement. And through our outreach process, leadership and engagement was highlighted a lot, and how we sort of solve for more than one problem and de-silo ourselves to the best of our abilities, right? And then the entire strategy is really focused on acknowledging that we have limited resources and that our focus should be on looking at our most vulnerable people, places, and systems first, and then building out a whole system approach from there. And looking at all of our shocks and stresses. So Los Angeles is sort of famous for being susceptible to almost everything. In the global network, we get made fun of a little bit, but not volcanoes, not hurricanes. There might be one more. But what we are acknowledging as either a risk or vulnerability includes earthquakes, fires, landslides, cybercrime and terrorism, riots, civil unrest, public health emergencies, chemical emergencies, tsunamis could happen, climate change, air quality pollution, urban heat islands, extreme heat, drought, severe weather and flooding, sea level rise, extreme cold also can happen, and then inequality, education, homelessness, lack of affordable housing, crime and violence, disparities in employment, in health, in access to open space, in transit, in food insecurity, and then aging infrastructure and infrastructure failure. And this is when sometimes we think, well, isn't this pretty much everything? And therefore, what is resilience? But it's really looking at how all of these vulnerabilities interact with each other and how, rather than just looking at solving for food insecurity, how can we solve for food insecurity through an earthquake or through changes in the climate and an earthquake? And how do we build on all of those vulnerabilities so that we can find the best solutions? So the way that we have organized all of the recommendations, so there are 96 recommendations. There are a whole host of sub-recommendations we've buried into those 96. But they really focus on making sure that we challenge everybody to find their role in resilience building. And so the working group discussions, the whole entire process was really focused on, yeah, we can talk about what the city can do, but if the city is investing in resilience and neighborhoods and individuals and the greater region aren't, well, then we're missing parts of the puzzle that are really, really important. And also, if an Angelino were to open this document and read just the first recommendation, it should be a recommendation that they could do today with existing resources and like make an impact in some way. So the first chapter is about safe and thriving Angelinos. It's about families, individuals, small businesses, the impact that mitigation could make at a parcel level. And really focuses on 3 goals, which I'm guessing you can't all read. Maybe not. But it's really to educate and engage Angelinos around risk reduction and preparedness so they can be self-sufficient for at least 7 to 14 days after a major shock. And when I started in this position, there was some mixed messaging around like 48 hours or 3 days of water or whatever. And I think we've learned through this past year of catastrophic events in other areas that no, like people need to start to realize that the city may not be up and running for a number of days, and what does that mean in terms of preparedness. Developing additional pathways to employment and the delivery of financial literacy tools to support our most vulnerable Angelinos. You know, part of looking at resilience comprehensively is recognizing you have to be prepared for a disaster, but you also have to I think in the United States, 50% of families couldn't withstand a $1,000 event in their lives that wasn't planned. It would not financially work for them. So how do we recognize that financial literacy, financial security of Angelinos will help us bounce back together much more easily after a major disruption, and how do we create additional economic security, especially for our most vulnerable. And then 3, cultivate leadership, stewardship, and equity with young Angelinos. This is the tried and true method of getting folks when they're young and impressionable and can tell their parents that they need to like shut off the water or recycle or all of that great work. I'm not going to get into this. However, I did go through all 96 recommendations and tried to highlight a few that I thought might be of most interest to you. And so in this chapter, we have recommendations around workforce preparedness, recognizing that there are 45,000 or so folks employed by the city of Los Angeles, and we really need to be leading by example in how we're prepared, especially because we serve as disaster service workers, and we need to be able to have our loved ones and our assets secured to come to work to help others. And so how do we make sure we're doing that to the best of our abilities all the time? Let's see. Really looking at capital project pipeline that creates living wage jobs for more Angelinos, looking at reintegration and successful reentry, education to career pipeline, and just creating next generation stewards of our city. So the second chapter is around strong and connected neighborhoods. And this is in recognition that in a place the size of Los Angeles, like each neighborhood's very different. And each neighborhood has different shocks and stresses that they should be prioritizing. What are the concerns? The concerns in Venice are very different than the concerns in Chatsworth. And recognizing that and really getting down to a block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood level on mitigation and adaptation techniques around resilience. And so there are a lot of ways that we can do that. This infographic is around neighborhood resilience hubs and this idea that specifically after Sandy, there were trusted neighborhood organizations in communities that happened to have their lights on and their doors got knocked on. And that is not rocket science. That is, if a community organization is trusted and they happen to be functioning after a major catastrophic event, then whatever their primary objective is quickly turns to disaster recovery. And so how do we work with nonprofit organizations and other community locations in neighborhoods to have that relationship established in advance of a disruption or major event? And how do we work with people who we know are going to have their doors knocked on to remind them that that might happen, and what can we do in advance to create opportunities for people to learn about climate adaptation or financial security resources or whatever that might be on a blue sky day, so that they know that that's the place they can go in a disaster for, to charge their cell phones or to get water or supplies or whatever that might be, or to organize or to communicate with their neighbors. So these goals include building social cohesion and increasing preparedness through community collaboration, increasing programs and partnerships that foster welcoming neighborhoods, prepare and protect those most vulnerable to extreme heat, and reduce health and wellness disparities across neighborhoods. And there's a lot here too. So looking at how we integrate resilience into community plans and the efforts that we're already working on. We've challenged all neighborhood councils to have preparedness plans completed by 2019. Especially this year, in December, we were reminded the importance of wildfire and mudslide risk reduction, and how can we do that better in those neighborhoods that are most vulnerable. Looking at creating an urban heat vulnerability index and mitigation plan and neighborhood retrofit pilot program around how, if we put all of the interventions around urban heat reduction into one place, how can we measure those outcomes and then be able to show tell that story so that we can continue to do that work. Looking at the neighborhood cooling center program and figuring out how to make that better, knowing that some of the projections are that we'll have more than 100 95-degree days in parts of the San Fernando Valley by 2040. How do we plan for that? It sounds miserable to me. Expanding mobile city services for vulnerable populations, increasing access to open space, specifically in underserved neighborhoods, and improving the health and well-being for all ages through improvements in mobility. All right, third chapter. So that's all about a prepared and responsive city. This is where it's really solving for more than one problem, using data-driven decision-making. I could read these goals. Integrate resilience principles into government to prioritize our most vulnerable people, places, and systems. Equip government with technology and data to increase situational awareness and expedite post-disaster recovery. Provide safe and affordable housing for all Angelenos. And restore, rebuild, and modernize Los Angeles's, I saw that typo, infrastructure. And some of the highlights here include resilience building as a permanent part of the city. That not only means my office has been institutionalized in some way, but it also means Mayor Garcetti signed an executive directive when he released the strategy on May 2nd, asking for chief resilience officers in many of the departments. And so we're looking at how to integrate resilience into department strategic plans, budgets, and the work that everyone does. My office is 2 people, and so looking at how we really can work with everyone in the city to work on resilience, because it's a big enough problem for more than 2 people, for sure. And then looking at how we do city capital planning. Part of how we solve for more than one problem and can integrate across silos. Developing citywide equity indicators, enhancing our use of data, specifically around crime and violence prevention. So I think Vision Zero is a good example of how we're already achieving this work. Citywide data integration of systems. How do we share more and share data and share what everyone has. Post-disaster restoration targets. These were first established in the Sustainable City Plan, but we moved up the date in this strategy to 2028. Advanced seismic safety, prioritizing our most vulnerable buildings, infrastructure, and systems. I would say a third of my time is spent solely on seismic work. Prioritize key neighborhoods for stormwater capture, urban greening, develop clean energy and smart grid infrastructure, expand electric fleets, charging infrastructure and energy backup, enhance the protection of critical digital assets, and then leverage infrastructure investment leading up to the Olympics and Paralympics to achieve our resilience goals. Perhaps that is why we moved up that date to 2028. Finally, I'm going to stop talking soon. Pioneering and collaborative partner. And so this chapter is really about if the city is, the shocks and stresses that we're susceptible to do not know our city boundaries. And they're really regional shocks and stresses, or in some cases could affect the globe. If we have a major catastrophic earthquake here with the port, with all of the other things that we do, that's going to be a global challenge. And so looking at how we look beyond our boundaries and partner with various sectors to expand our resilience and really make this partnerships with neighboring cities, with the region, with the state, federal government, and with our global resilience builders in other urban areas throughout the world. These goals include using climate science to develop adaptation strategies consistent with the Paris Climate Agreement, foster a healthy and connected Los Angeles river system, strengthen regional systems and fortify critical infrastructure, grow public, private, and philanthropic partnerships that will increase resources dedicated to building resilience. I think part of the challenge with this work is that sometimes we say, oh, it's going to be fine. You know, it's been 24 years since our last major earthquake, and it wasn't even that big, honestly. And we've found through this research that about 42% of Angelenos weren't born or weren't here in the early 90s. And so they did not experience the shocks and stresses of the early 90s. And so I was in Houston maybe 2 weeks ago talking with their recovery folks, their planning department, and so on, about how they transitioned from Harvey recovery to resilience. And one of the things that they mentioned is, you know, a lot of these urban locations have experienced their shock, which helps them to think about how to do things more resiliently. But in Los Angeles, our last major shock was 24 years ago. And so how do we continue to have that urgency, even though things have been, you know, okay in terms of some of our major disruptions? We still have a lot of challenges that we're addressing on a day-to-day basis. So here is the last list. Let's see, zero emissions technology at the port, fossil fuel-free streets, emergency access and evacuation routes being expanded and really leveraging the investments around the LA River in a super creative way to expedite evacuation if we needed to. Advance regional seismic safety, look at pre-recovery funding opportunities. So this is where we know that if we spend $1 on the front end, we're going to save $4 to $8 to $12 on the back end. But the way that the system is structured, we only get money on the back end. So how do we continue to talk about our vulnerabilities and the opportunities we have to better our systems? and not say, oh yeah, we're going to be fine. We could handle another Northridge, it would be okay. It would not be okay. And so how do we speak very transparently about that so that we can attract additional resources so that we can fix those things in advance of something happening. Fortify critical lifeline infrastructure and supply chains. Encourage increased access to emergency power for critical services. Advance regional transportation and transit resilience. Fortify public health and healthcare critical infrastructure. Launch an earthquake early warning system. And build resilience around the globe. That's it. So the way that we've tried to prioritize all that I have thrown at you, and I really didn't include everything, so, is around 25 or so targets. And so this is what we're going to hold ourselves accountable towards. First, and most importantly, no, I'm kidding, expand the Mayor's Office of Resilience by the end of this year. We have 2 people. We need at least 3. Designate Department Chief Resilience Officers by April of 2018, and that's happening now. Figure out how to track and report on resilience outcomes to show measurable progress for our most vulnerable populations and neighborhoods by 2022. And this is something that we're working with 100 resilient cities on. That organization has really pivoted from an organization that was most interested in planning documents to an organization that is most interested in implementation. And so a lot of the resources that we're going to have to implement this strategy through our partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation and 100 Resilient Cities really is to prove that this resilience lens and the way that we've organized this strategy is effective, is solving for more than one problem, does achieve our goals so that we can continue to do it. And so we're really a bit of a guinea pig, and we're having to show measurable outcomes and prove that resilience isn't just a buzzword, it really is the way that we should be doing things. I'm not gonna read all of these, but I will highlight things I haven't talked about most of them. And then I'd say 4 or 5 of these are existing goals, like preserve existing affordable housing, reduce the unsheltered population by at least half by 2022 is a pretty new thing our office is committed to. And then develop resilience hubs in our most vulnerable neighborhoods by 2028. Accelerate reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and meet or exceed climate resilience outcomes consistent with Paris Climate Agreement by 2020. Increase equitable tree canopy coverage by 2028. And then finally, these are fun. Advance a coordinated approach to capital planning and infrastructure investment by 2022. Apply resilience criteria to projects that prioritize investments in capital planning and critical infrastructure by 2022. Some departments are looking at ways to apply resilience criteria or sustainability criteria in certain ways. And so I think one of the opportunities we have in the next year is to look at the best practices that exist within the city and be able to share that through the departmental chief resilience officers and by working more closely with the departments on some of this work. Invest in green infrastructure and storm water retention, modernize the power grid, and invest in our most vulnerable buildings to withstand seismic and climate threats by 2043, which is when the retrofits should all be completed. So here's the awesome slide of Mayor Garcetti signing the executive directive to implement all of this work. And if you would like to read all 180 pages in English or in Spanish, or there's a executive summary that I think does the trick too. Or if you want to contact me, or if you want to keep involved in all of this resilience building, it's all lamayor.org/resilience. Now, questions. Are you overwhelmed? I've been doing this for 3 years. Like, it's less overwhelming. Although I would say that even this morning we were talking about a scenario, and I had one of those moments. It usually happens once a week where I was like, "Oh, I didn't think about that. That's awful. Like, what are we? We're not gonna lead with that." And it was about having the Hollywood Fault. I'll just tell you having the Hollywood Fault cut off or like splice the LA River. Like that. Anyway, leads to a lot of flooding, which is the conversation we were having. So, any questions? Yeah.
I have so many questions, but I'm just going to ask like one or two. I think something that I hear a lot, so we've been having a lot of meetings around open space, especially as the general plan update process is happening, and some of the suggestions that are that keep emerging, I think, from various communities are planning around earthquake faults, fault lines, and perhaps designating those areas as open space. I don't know how feasible that is considering how many faults we have in the city, but I was just curious if that has come up and what your thinking is around.
I would say that has come up as a global conversation. So we'll keep this as a global conversation. A lot of cities that have been experiencing earthquakes. So I was in Mexico City with the chief resilience officers of Wellington and Christchurch and Kyoto and Colima, Cali. And so we get to talk about like what they're doing, what we're doing. And when it comes to these questions after the fact, well, there are really three. Let's see if I can remember. You can either retrofit, you can relocate, or you can rebuild. And a lot of these cities are looking at relocating a lot of people after the fact. And we toured an area of Mexico City which was like semi-formal development, and so it was a really rough conversation about how if your development rights aren't formal, then you're going to be living in a red tagged building, which is what everyone was doing. And so how can we learn from those global challenges and apply things here? And I think the Bay Area is actually looking at a land swap situation. I've been academically talking about how transfer of development rights could be applied to a lot of these challenges in a way where we know where we want growth as a city. And so there are transfer of development rights so that we could transfer those development rights from vulnerable areas to where we want growth. And we would just need to look at how to do that in a positive way. I think one of the recommendations is around creating emergency land use tools before an event. And part of that is because some of the disaster helps to some extent, though not totally, pick which neighborhoods win and lose in these situations. And a lot of the historic background to neighborhoods also is a huge contributor there. But there are things that we can do in advance to have the conversations about the tools that are separate from the conversations about which neighborhoods we have to apply the tools to. And I think with that conversation, it's like, what should we be doing as a best practice? And then figuring out where to apply those best practices on sort of the neighborhood scale. It's tricky. I think we should do it, but that's a personal opinion.
Okay, so, you say a major earthquake, we may be without water and power and
Yeah.
police coverage may be somewhat reduced, and fire protection is somewhat reduced. So neighborhoods may be on their own
Yes.
to some extent.
They will be on their own.
Okay, so I'm sure that is there a chapter in here on how neighborhoods can be educated and
Yep.
trained, if you will, to come together in the time of crisis?
Yeah, so
Maybe I was thinking even, this would be a great way even to energize neighborhood watch. I know my neighborhood watch has kind of gone dormant. We met, for years and complaints about trash pickup and petty crime and this and that, but, and those topics were ongoing, but this resiliency goal and program would be a great way to energize neighborhood watch groups again and give them a reason to come together and plan in advance for this kind of eventuality.
Yep. Your comment speaks directly to why we created the structure that we did in terms of scales and how that first chapter and that second chapter is really about homes and neighborhoods. And there are a lot of recommendations in them about recognizing, I can't remember what it is. I don't want to get it wrong. I'm just going to look it up because I have this nice resource here. So 1/3 of Americans say they've never interacted with the people living next door. So this idea that neighbors and neighborhoods will be the first responders. Our in a San Andreas event, we may not have water. A San Andreas event that is strong enough will cut off all 4 aqueducts. We import 85% of our water. 85% of our water will be cut off in a large magnitude San Andreas event. And so that means limited water for 6 to 18 months, best case. Those are just things that we need to communicate to people in a way that isn't terrifying, but is also like, if you don't have water storage, I have more water storage in my 600 square foot apartment and in my car than I think anyone else because of some of these risks. And so recognizing that if people don't know their neighbors and they live next to, someone who has limited mobility issues, feeling that right now, or is dependent on medications or on electricity or whatever that might be, like, we're trying to get the word out about the importance of neighborhood preparedness plans. There are emergency management department is launching a new Ready Your LA Neighborhood program. The American Red Cross has been doing a number of community resilience plans in some of our most vulnerable neighborhoods. And then there's a Cool Blocks program that's kind of a workbook for neighbors and neighborhoods to go through certain very simple scenarios of how they can address disaster preparedness together, or climate adaptation, or equity, or being just better neighbors. And that's a huge part of this work. There are some interesting statistics that I don't know off the top of my head, but about Katrina recovery and how the communities in New Orleans that worked together regularly to build floats for Mardi Gras were the ones that came back first. So that social cohesion aspect of this is incredibly important. Yeah. In the back.
So how are you guys working with like individual groups within the department? Like I'm in transit, and you're talking about the valley. We have dash routes in the valley, and not something that's so dire, but like a heat event. Mm-hmm. Like it would be easy for you guys to notify us, and we put out to our riders, hey, this is the nearest cooling station on the route. We're dash, so it's relatively cheap, so it would help the vulnerable. So what are you doing in terms of that?
Yeah, so I'm here. I think part of the we have a lot of opportunities, right? We've been working to get to this point, and as I regularly say, like the release of this document is so very important. It is in fact the beginning. Like that was the first step. And now we really need to figure out how to have these conversations with the right people, or better yet, like empower the right people to go forth and make these decisions, because we've had a lot of conversations about how if the cooling centers are far from transit, then they're probably not the most effective cooling center. And I can tell you that today, like for sure. And so how do we have those conversations and better align those resources? And I mean, we can easily do some of these things. It's just a matter of recognizing the importance of coordinating and of seeing sort of our day-to-day opportunities through this doom and gloom lens that I brought to you today. And how do we work together? So it's a great example of things that we should be doing. Yeah. So the departmental chief resilience officers, the hope here is that will help. We've been working with some departments for the last few years implementing resilience by design, but there needs to be a lot more coordination. And I say that in the same breath, I say I have an office of two. So, yeah.
Just to build on Jacob Miles' question, so I think I've been identified as the Chief Resilience Officer for the department, so I'm excited to work with you. I'm thrilled that you're here. I'm thrilled that the plan is here. I've only been here 2 months, but one of my goals is to get our workforce prepared and trained in just general preparedness at home. It all starts at the individual level. Yes, we all live in communities and neighbors, but if you're not prepared at home and your family's not prepared, if something happens during the work day, we're not going to be very much used to the city if we're worried about home. So one of my main messages is just being prepared at home. And as you get prepared at home, that spreads throughout your neighborhood. You take the CERT class, the Community Emergency Response Team from the fire department. One of the things I'm looking at is tailoring that to our DOT folks in bite-sized portions that we can do it in 1-hour blocks over a 2-month period, get the same type of material. But I mean, all of our main goals is to be prepared at home, so we don't have to worry about our friends and our family and our property. If something were to happen here, we are all disaster service workers, but short of that, it's what we have to do. I mean, just even if we didn't work for the city, everybody should be prepared. We know we're at potential risk just in general. There's nowhere that doesn't have natural or man-made hazards. So kind of a heads up that a lot of education is going to be coming, a lot of training opportunities, and it really comes down to like your idea about water. I'm the same way. I'm not allowed to even buy water in my house anymore. I hide it. If you look under any pile of clothes, there's a gallon of water. You look at my car, there's a couple of cases of water, and it's because that really is the number one thing that you want to get prepared for. The other part of it is I like to, and I think it works with our equity approach, think about more kind of tangible ways to get prepared that are not the Encino Man concept where you're kind of burying everything in your backyard and not worrying about it for 4.5 years and hoping, right before that 5-year expiration date, something goes bad so you didn't waste your money. What I want to do is get this culture of always having preparedness supplies. And I've been doing emergency management for a long time. I am comfortable now saying I do not have an emergency preparedness kit. I never have, but I have at least 3 weeks of food and water at home. It's not freeze-dried kind of food that tastes like a tree or something like that. But I know I've got enough soup, and we've got dry cereal, and we've got water, that if something were to happen, we do have what we need. If something were to happen during the day, and I'm here, God forbid, I don't need to go home and worry about who's picking up the kids, what do we have? And that's really the message that I want to get across to us. Because believe me, when it does happen, PD, fire, mayor's office, they are going to be expecting us to come to work and do our job to support the city. And we're going to be of no use if we're not ready at the individual level. So it's really not necessarily a wake-up call, but having you here is the support for us in the department to kind of spread this message and take action.
Well, and I think in each of your individual roles, to the extent that we can have conversations about what I have learned through sort of the network of resilience practices globally. So one more example that I wanted to make sure that I mentioned to you all was part of my last trip to Mexico City was actually to meet with their bike share group to talk about how their bike share was used after the September 19th earthquake. They made it free for anyone who had a bike share account for a few days so that people could take those bikes and get home or get back or get where they needed to go. And they popped up certain locations where people who, if they didn't have accounts, could create accounts. So because cars weren't going anywhere, and part of the challenge in Mexico City, like Los Angeles, is that after a major earthquake, the roads are not going to necessarily be working the way they do on a blue sky day. And what other alternatives are there? And in Mexico City, bikes worked well. And so that's just another example of things that we don't think about on a regular day necessarily, but as other locations experience challenges, we can learn from them, and part of the network is to really look at all of these other places and be able to apply their lessons learned here, so that hopefully we'll never have to apply our own lessons here, but we probably will. Yeah, in the
I
back.
also gravitated toward the theme of neighborhoods, and throughout your recommendations, you identified vulnerable neighborhoods. In the interest of time, maybe you can just point to where on the report we can learn more about the criteria that you use to evaluate what is a vulnerable neighborhood.
Sure. So it depends on the shock or stress, right? So we didn't, we highlighted certain shocks and stresses. For instance, we have maps in the report, chapter 2, around urban heat or around our wildfire zones. There's Trust for Public Land has a climate smart cities tool that we used, and there are maps in the report in chapter 2 around social vulnerabilities. My favorite resource that the city has to date is really the health index. We didn't create additional resources. We really tried to leverage what's already out there. Part of our approach has really been to try not to recreate anything, to try and use existing systems and processes, because we have a lot to do with in the name of urgency. But it's we show sea level rise, vulnerabilities, and so it sort of depends on what you're talking about. And so I think our charge of looking at the most vulnerable people, places, and systems is a little bit based on whatever discussion you're having, trying to solve for like the weakest chain. We could get into how some of our traditionally labeled vulnerable neighborhoods are probably some of our most resilient neighborhoods, discussion at a later date. Anything else?
Very quick, does each council office have a resiliency coordinator?
Not at this time.
They should.
That is the first I've heard that idea. I think it's a great one.
So I had a bunch of questions, but I think I'd rather talk to you offline.
Yeah.
And just a couple of them were already answered.
Okay.
But I guess maybe an easy one is, does being designated a resilient city, does that open you up to any opportunities in terms of funding?
Yeah. So we have the ability to work with 100 Resilient Cities platform partners that offer pro bono services to the city for various things. We've taken advantage of a number of them over the last 2 years, but that hasn't been our main focus. Now, that's our main focus. So we're charged with implementing everything we said we were going to do. And that's going to take many, many, many more resources than the city has. And so looking at partnerships, looking at pro bono services, and then looking at things like taking better advantage of hazard mitigation funding at the state level, looking at other state and federal resources. Prior to 2 years ago, the way that the federal government was headed was that there would be a preference for funding for municipalities that were acknowledging their risk in the way that the resilience strategy does, and not trying to, rebuild in a flood zone 3 times over. And I think, the conversation I had in Houston was very much like, the federal government is not going to be shelling out money to do things the way that we've done them in the past. We need to be smarter about the decisions that we make. And that's why our focus and our main message for the last few years has been all of the things that we're doing before an event. And we're trying to get as many things sort of shored up before an event, because it's going to be less of an investment on the front end than it will be on the back end. But yeah, we're trying. It's like one big prospectus. It's like one big, we need partners and help, and everybody has a role in this, because it's going to take everybody. Yeah. On that note.
It's 1:30.